And all these scripture texts that we're going to look at are there. And also the song service is there as well that we're going to have afterwards. So all the lyrics of the songs that we're going to sing in the third hour are on that website, as well as the scriptures for this Bible study are there. So you can look at them there. And it works on your phone, but it works really well on a tablet. So if you're looking at it, you want to look at that on an iPad or some type of a tablet, is really good as far as that. But it also works on your phone. And then I'll give the references, and you can just look them up in your old school Dead Tree Bible. You can look it up in there too. So we're going to be continuing the Sunday school lesson on the last conversation. This is the conversation that Jesus had. We're going to move on into the larger section, this is what we could call the second act, which is the largest part of it. So you had a very small part where he's having a conversation with his enemies. Judas Iscariot is present. Satan is present. And at the end of the text, where we got done reading, Judas Iscariot has eaten the piece of bread. I don't know if I ever explained that, but if you don't know what a sop is, that's like a little piece of bread that you dip it in your gravy. That's right. So it'd be like you take a little piece of bread and you got some gravy left on your plate. You soak it up with your bread and you eat it. Some of you are getting hungry. That's what a sop is. It's what you would soak up juice with, and then you'd eat that little piece of bread. That's what Jesus gave Judas Iscariot, and he told what appears to be John. We don't know that it's John, but it seems to be it was John, speaking of himself in the third person, who had asked Jesus, right, who is it? And Jesus says, I'm going to give this piece of bread to somebody, and whoever I give it to, that's who's going to betray me. And he gave it to Judas Iscariot. Judas Iscariot eats it, and it says that with or after the piece of bread he eats it, Satan enters into him, and then Jesus tells him, whatever you're going to do quickly. So Judas Iscariot leaves, and this is the brilliance of John's writing. It really is really brilliant writing, is that at the end of that, so at the beginning he went through and described all that's going on both in Jerusalem at that time, as well as like what's going on in the spiritual realm, right, in eternity. All that's going on, what's going on in Jesus' mind. And then you have that whole thing of him washing everyone's feet and doing all that. And then when it ends, Judas leaves, and then he concludes that section by saying, and it was night, or it was dark. And so that just sort of sets up that whole thing, and it contextualizes Judas Iscariot, where when he's going out into the dark. And so it's all the imagery involved, and none of this is accidental, right? He's pointing these out because it gives you a visual context to think of, or how to think of these things. So Judas Iscariot is leaving the presence of light, and he's going out into the dark. And all of that is intentionally written that way. John didn't make these details up, and they're real details. I mean, it really was dark outside, but he didn't have to mention that. He mentions it because that imagery, it just paints a picture in your mind. And the reason I point that out is, I think we read the Bible far too dry, right? I think we just like repeat the words when we're reading it. We don't really think of how it's read. And there's a number of things that I think are responsible for that. One of them is this view that the Bible is this sacred writing, which it is, but it tends to be seen that way in the sense that it cannot be approached, and so we almost just read it monotonely rather than realize that this is written purposefully in a way that's supposed to resonate with you. Another problem is if you're reading it in a translation that you don't understand well, then you should read it in one you do understand well. I personally really like the way the King James Bible is written. I like the English that it uses. But if you struggle understanding that, then you ought to get yourself one that is much more current or more modern, and start there if it's more important that you understand it, okay? And that when you read it, you actually understand the words you're enunciating. Otherwise, why not just read it in Latin? If you're not going to understand the words you're pronouncing and you're just saying syllables that are meaningless in your mind, then what use is that? How is that helpful? That's essentially taking the position that the Bible is like a book of spells, that all that matters is that you say them just right. You don't actually have to understand anything. That's not how you should read it. You should read it in a way that you actually give meaning to what's being said. And I know I'm not great at that, but I have tried to do that in these classes and lately. When I read it, I try to read it in a way where you're actually making sense of what's going on, right? And you can find Bible apps that have people reading the Bible that way who are really, really good at it. One of the best ones is there's a Bible app called the YouVersion, as in Y-O-U, YouVersion. And the King James one has a professional actor from New York reading it. And he's like great. I mean, he's really good. And I would encourage you, if you can get that, it's free. You can just download it, put it on your phone. You go in there to any passage. It has a little place where you can tap on it, and it'll start reading it out loud to you. And listen to how he reads it. It's not corny. It's not hokey, but it's really good. And you will find that a lot of times when you're not understanding, it isn't because you don't understand the words that you're reading. It's just because you're reading it all monotone. Like if there's no real change in who's saying what attitude are they saying it with, and all of that makes a big difference to you actually enjoying reading the Bible, okay? So I want to encourage you to all of that. All right, having said that, let's move on then. So Judas is left, right? And this is where we pick up on the story, which is chapter 13, verse 31. We're only going to read till 35. We're going to look at this passage just today. So we'll read that, and then we'll look at it, okay? So he says, therefore, when Judas was gone out, Jesus said, now is the Son of Man glorified, and God is glorified in him. If God be glorified in him, God shall also glorify him in himself, and shall straightway glorify him. Little children, I am with you for yet a little while. You will seek me. And as I said unto the Jews, where I go, you cannot come. So now I say unto you also, a new commandment I give unto you, that ye love one another. As I have loved you, that you also love one another. By this shall all men know that you are my disciples, if you have love one to another. Okay, let's look at a few, excuse me, let's look at a few textual issues or textual considerations in this. And by that I mean just distinct elements in the text that we should consider, that we should understand, to be able to understand all that's going on. First of all, let's consider when he calls them little children. This is actually this is rare. So this is the only time that the Gospels record Jesus using this term. And this in the Greek is one word. In English, we have two words because we don't have a word that does it well. Now, Spanish does. So if you read this in Spanish, they use the word hijitos because it's a diminutive, right? The closest I could come up to one word that kind of expresses what he's trying to say would be kiddos, right? Without any condescension, right? It'd be like my kiddos. It's how he's referring to them. He doesn't mean that they're children in the sense of age. He's referring to them in an endearing way. Sometimes they translate it, dear children. Kinda. There's not a good single word to do it with. I think this one's pretty good. But so you understand what he's saying. When he says little children, he doesn't mean that in any condescending way. It's the way, it's like in Spanish, it's very common in Spanish for men to call their wives chunky or fatty. I don't know why. It's real funny. You hear it. You go to Mexico. When we first went, it was like very odd because they're like, "Hey, gorda," and that's endearing, right? That's what they and "Hey, gordo," that's what they call each other. And you hear that here, and it's like, that doesn't sound right. If you did that, don't do that to your wife. Hey, chunky, yeah, you're not gonna see her for about 3 days, and then you'll finally start to see her out of one eye when it starts to open up, right? And so a lot of times these kind of things don't translate across languages, right? Well, that's kind of like this. Sometimes you read something like little children, and we get maybe a little bit of the wrong impression. He doesn't mean that in any negative or condescending way. He's not saying this like, you dumb little kids. That's not what it means. It's the same way in the Gospels when Jesus, at the weddings of Canaan, and Mary comes to Jesus and says, they don't have any wine. And he says, "Woman, it's not my time." And we read that and we think, oh, he was being pretty, he's laying down the law. Hey, woman. Because if you told someone that today in America in English, well, that's how it sounds, right? It's like, hey, woman. It's like, whoa, hey, what's up with you? So, but that's not at all what that means. It would be more like lady, perhaps. We don't have a good way of saying that in English, but it's not in any way disrespectful. In Spanish and Greek are very similar, so there's a lot of these work out really well in Spanish, right? So Spanish, it would be like saying doña, how this comes across. It's a respectful way of saying that. So a lot of this stuff sometimes gets lost in translation when you're reading it. So you got to be careful not to read the Bible with preconceptions that you have from English. Just because when you hear it in your English mind and you hear it one way, it doesn't mean that's how it was said. It doesn't mean that that's exactly what it means. So you got to be very careful with these preconceived notions of what these mean. So when Jesus tells them little children, he is saying this in a very warm and a very tender way, very gentle speaking to them. One way that we could maybe look at it was the way Brother Trinidad always talks to us, right? He calls us beloved. Everyone loves it when he says that, beloved, and everyone feels great about it, right? And that's kind of maybe how you can look at how Jesus was telling them. He's saying, beloved children, right? It's not about you're immature or you're small. This is a way of speaking to them very gently and warmly, okay? And John, in the first epistle, uses this term quite a few times. I think it's like 12 or 13 times that John uses that to refer to the church, and he's doing it in the same way. So if you go to 1 John and read 1 John, that term is scattered all through the first epistle of John. And so he picked up on it, and he's dealing a lot with the same issues, and he uses that term to reference the church, okay? So that's one of the things that we should look at. There is another one let's look at, and that's where Jesus says, and this may sound kind of odd, perhaps, if you hear it, and some people have even concluded, and I think it's because of preconceived notions, they've concluded that somehow the Gospel of John is anti-Semitic, right? And if you read any type of literature on the Gospels, the Gospel of John is often accused of being anti-Semitic. And so this might be one reason why some people would fear it that way. So Jesus says in verse 33, he says, "You will seek me, and as I said unto the Jews, where I go, you cannot come." It just sounds like he's saying, we're not the Jews, right? I said this to the Jews. And John talks that way some, and it may sound, if you read that, you're like, well, aren't they all Jews, right? So let's talk about that for a minute, because it's important to understand not just this passage, but others that deal with this. Okay, so the Jews are the Judeans. That's where we get the word Jews from. When the Jewish people were taken to captivity, first the northern kingdom and then followed by the southern kingdom, the northern kingdom never really came back, right? The southern kingdom, the Judeans, the ones from Judah. So if you look at Israel, let's look at Israel like this, right? After Solomon, that kingdom, the Israel, got split into two, and the northern half of the kingdom, which were the 10 smaller tribes, right, that they became the northern kingdom, and the southern kingdom, which was Benjamin and Judah, that was That was the kingdom that stayed with David's lineage, okay? His most direct descendants. And so that's how they divided between the northern and the southern. Well, the northern kingdom, they never were very good. They were backslidden almost immediately, and they were always worse than the southern kingdom. And so they were both backsliding, but the northern much faster, okay? Well, they got taken away in captivity, and then the southern kingdom got taken away. Well, the northern tribes never really came back. So when the southern tribes actually came back, they just took over all the land. Okay? So they were all Judeans, in that they were all from Judah, which is where we get the word Judeans. They're from Judah, right? And they just sort of populated it all. But that same northern-southern division, it still stayed there. And so even though they were Judeans up in the north, right, they started to differentiate in a lot of ways. For instance, their dialect was different. Remember when Peter when Peter's tempted, when Christ is being tried, and then they tell Peter, "We know you're with him because your speech betrays you." What they're saying is, you speak as a Galilean. Think of it this way. Think of the difference between how northerners here in the United States speak and southerners speak. If you are a southerner and you go up to Michigan, where my family's from, they're gonna pinpoint you right away that you're not from these parts, are you? Right? Because you just have a way of speaking. Now, you don't hear it because to you, that's normal. But as soon as you get around people who aren't that way, or someone from Boston, South Boston comes, right, down here, well, you know right away, you're not from here, are you? Right? Because your speech betrays you, the way you talk, your accent. Well, the Galileans had a certain accent, and they were considered the way northerners, the Yankees, think of you southerners, right, that you're slow and you're hicks and whatever they think, and that division is there. Well, that's how the Judeans, the people living in the south of Israel, thought of the Galileans. And they have them in very high regard, okay? And they considered them to be quite far away from the center of religion, and there's a lot of things involved with that. But anyways, when Jesus is saying, "I told the Jews this," he doesn't mean the Israelites, he means the Judeans. Because he, at least his upbringing, right? He was born in Judah. He was born in Bethlehem, which is in the southern kingdom. But he grew up in Galilee, up in the north. That's where he grew up. And all his apostles, apparently, they say, as far as we can tell, all the apostles were from the north also, except maybe Judas Iscariot. There's some evidence that Judas Iscariot was a Judean, which it really would be quite ironic, right? Because the Jews, the Judeans, considered Galileans to be prone to heresy, prone to blasphemy, prone to backsliding. It would be pretty ironic if the one Judean in the group turned out to be Judas Iscariot. Anyways, so you have those two things, and Jesus is from Galilee. So when Jesus says, "I told the Jews this," he means I told the Judeans that I was speaking to this, because that's where he's at right now. They're down in the south. So they had that natural division between Galileans and Judeans. So when you read the Gospels, you'll realize that Christ kept traveling back and forth between Judah and Galilee. Galilee's up in the north, right? He'd go up to Galilee. That's where his family was from. That's where he was from. That's where all his apostles were from. They were all from up there. So he'd travel up, and then they'd come down for the feast, because that's what you were supposed to do. You're supposed to come down to Jerusalem, you celebrate one of the feasts, and then he'd go back up to where he was from. And so that's what he's talking about there. Okay. Having said that now, hope that helps you kind of understand a little bit more about what's going on there as far as just some of the technical elements. So let's now look at a little more of what he's saying. So here's what happens in this text. Judas leaves. And as soon as Judas leaves, it's like there's this huge relief in the room, and you can almost just feel it in how John writes it, right? As soon as Judas leaves, it says, Judas has gone out, and Jesus says, it's like in the writing, it's instantaneous. As soon as the door closes, Jesus, almost sounds like a sigh of relief, says, "Now is the Son of Man glorified." See, you can almost, if you read it, it's just, you can almost just feel the tension has left the room. I mean, think about what's going on before this. Jesus is sitting there saying, one of you is going to betray me. Everyone's looking around. Is it me? And the room is just full of tension, and no one can speak freely. Peter is beckoning to John, ask who it is. John is like whispering, who is it? Jesus is saying, I'm going to dip a piece of bread, and I'm going to give. I mean, there's just no freedom to speak in the room. It's just oppressed. As soon as Judas, carrying with him Satan, leave the room, it's like immediate relief. And then Jesus gives an auto-doxology. Doxology is a praise, a worship, right? Which is basically he does it for himself. He auto-doxes himself. That's not the exact word, but anyways. So what does he say? He says, now is the Son of Man glorified. I want you to think back to what we talked about as far as what Jesus did in the presence of his enemies. This is the exact opposite of what, again, I want to reiterate. We talked about this, but I want to reiterate. This is the opposite of what we would expect it. If Jesus is in the presence of Judas Iscariot and Satan and his enemies, and they're all plotting on him, you would think that what he would do in that moment is to elevate himself, to inflate himself, if you will, to make himself seem or be bigger, right? Pound his chest, so to speak. That's I think we would expect that. That's how we tend to react, right? If we feel that there's antagonism against us, well, we don't shrink back, we puff up. But Christ does the opposite, right? When he's dealing with Judas and Satan, what he does is strip down to a towel and wash people's feet. Completely not what we expected to do. And when they leave, and he no longer has anyone, quote unquote, to impress, then what does he do? Well, then he starts saying, now I'm going to be glorified. It's a complete opposite, I think, of what most people would do and what probably most people would expect. It tells us some things, like we talked about already. We talked about what he was doing as he washed their feet. But now that they're gone, he wants his disciples, the true believers, to understand what spiritual ramifications they're going to be to what they're about to see. So they don't understand. Again, this is the dramatic irony we talked about. The disciples didn't know what was coming. They didn't realize what was going to happen. They didn't put two and two together until long time later. It was a long time later before they started putting all this together. But we know what's going to happen. And what's coming up, it seems like it's going to be the humiliation of the Messiah. And Jesus wants to make sure that they understood and you understand that was not his humiliation. Very important to understand that. Very important. We often think of Jesus being crucified as being humiliated, but that's not how he looked at it. He said, now I'm glorified. And God's going to be glorified in me, and I'm going to be glorified in him. Okay? So, but let's consider how he says it and why it's meaningful. So what he says is, the way he puts it is this. He says, verse 31, Jesus said, now is the Son of Man glorified. There are two appellations, two titles that the scriptures use for Jesus. There's many, but there's two main ones you find in the Gospels. You have the Son of God, which many people are very familiar with, right? That's actually a very common one. And then you have the Son of Man. Now, to me, it's a very interesting, these two, because like I say, we're very familiar with the Son of God. Thinking of Jesus as the Son of God, that's like very central to most people's orthodox theological perspective, Son of God. But do you realize that the Son of Man title is far more common in the scriptures? In fact, there's only 3 places where Jesus calls himself the Son of God. And there's like tons of them where he calls himself the Son of Man. It's far, far more common, the Son of Man title. We often think, well, the Son of God title, that would be the one that would get people really riled up, right? Actually, it isn't. It's the Son of Man title that gets people riled up. Long past when Christ had already ascended into heaven. Remember when Stephen is preaching and they're mad and they throw him out and they're going to stone him? And he looks up and he says, I see heaven open and the Son of Man standing by the right hand of the Father. And they get so furious they kill Stephen because he said he saw the Son of Man there. This was a title that was really a trigger thing, right? It was really triggering for the Jewish people, and that would get you canceled in a very permanent way, right? They had a permanent cancel culture. There's no coming back from it. And so here Christ uses this one. Now we could think that they're like synonymous, and it doesn't really matter, but they're really not. They're not synonymous. So let's talk a little bit about these things. And let me point something else interesting out to you that you can go and look up and analyze. If you look at the Gospel of Mark, Mark opens his Gospel in a very interesting way. He says, the beginning of the Gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of Man. That's how he opens it up. It's very interesting, right? But here's what's interesting about that. He only uses that title after that twice. So it's the gospel of the Son of Man, but he only uses that 2 times. The other gospels use that title a lot more. A lot more. John uses it a lot. Luke uses it a lot. Matthew a lot. We're talking about maybe 10, 12 each. Mark uses it twice, not counting the introduction of the gospel. Why is that interesting? Well, I think Mark is trying to argue for. He's trying to prove that Jesus is the Son of Man. So he doesn't just go around calling him that. I think he makes the case for that. And when he gets done making that case, he uses it 2 times. Both times are when it's being basically concluded. The first one is in Mark chapter 3, that the demons acknowledge that he's the Son of Man, right? That's the demons do. In Mark chapter 3, verse 11, the demons acknowledge that Jesus is the Son of Man. And the last one is the important one. It's at the end of the book, Matthew 15. So he's gone through and all the life of Jesus has taken place. He's on the cross. He expires. He says it's finished and he dies. And the centurion looks up and says, truly, this was the Son of Man. So, I'm sorry, I got that mixed up. It's the Son of God. I switched him when I was talking. I'm getting them all mixed up. Anyways, he says, truly this man is the Son of God. So these are the only 2 in Mark where this is brought up. Even though he says that the gospel of the Son of God. So it's very interesting how these are phrased. So when we look at these 2 terms, you have the term the Son of God and you have the term the Son of Man. And you put these together, we wonder, what is the distinction between these? Why is it the Son of God sometimes and the Son of Man others? So there's a way that I think that we need to understand what they're saying here. The Son of God refers to the unity of Christ with the Father. So whenever we find in the Scriptures that he's speaking of Christ as the Son of God, it's referring to him as his unity with the Father. So if you think about it along Trinitarian lines, when it refers to Christ as the Son of God, that's Christ and one with the Father. Son of Man refers to Christ as his being distinct from the Father, subordinate to the Father. That's him as the Son, submissive to the Father's will. And you can look through the Gospels and find a whole lot of these where you're going to find this, where you're going to find that it's the Son of Man who is hung on the tree. Now, I'm not saying these are different people, but it's different perspectives of Christ. And one perspective of Christ is that he's one with the Father, and the other one is that he's subordinate to the Father. And these terminologies illustrate that Trinitarian doctrine. Okay, So let's look a little bit at what it tells us, the Bible tells us about the Son of Man. Let's look at John chapter 3 and verse 13. This is John 3 is one where you have both of these terms put together. You have the Son of Man and the Son of God, John chapter 3, and I want you to notice how Christ differentiates these terms. So this is his conversation with Nicodemus. He says, "And no man hath ascended up to heaven, but he that came down from heaven, even the Son of Man, which is in heaven. And as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have eternal life." So here you have very famous passage. He says he's going to be lifted up. Now we all now know what he meant by that. We'll get to that in a second. But what he says is it's the Son of Man that will be lifted up. But then just a few verses later, he says in verse 18, "He that believes on him is not condemned, but he that believes not is condemned already, because he has not believed in the name of the only begotten Son of God." You see how he's changed the terminology that he's using. When he's speaking of the Son as being one with the Father in his glory, it's the Son of God. And when he's speaking of himself as his humanity, dying, suffering, he's the Son of Man. So this is how this terminology is used, and it's why we have the Son of God being used so sparingly in the Scriptures, because Christ didn't walk around asserting his divinity. Not that he never did, but it wasn't what he commonly did. When they asked him once, the Pharisees asked him, "Are you the Son of God?" He says, "That's what you say." When they say, "You make yourself like God," instead of saying, "Well, I am God," he says, "Well, your law says that you're God's. So what does that mean?" So Christ doesn't face that issue right square on. But on the issue of the Son of Man, he's unambiguous about this. Unambiguous. Now, it may seem that calling himself the Son of Man is somehow deprecating, but it really isn't. And we'll look at that in a second. I want you to notice one thing important in John 3 before we move on from there. When Jesus says that the Son of Man is going to be lifted up, that terminology, that's actually what he meant by that. He meant the ambiguity that you see there. What does he mean by lifted up? Well, right, it can mean, you're like literally, like physically, I should say, picked up, right? Like lifted up like this. And it also can mean lifted up, like exalted, like glorified. He actually uses a word that is ambiguous and is meant to be taken either way. When you first hear that, you think, well, the Son of Man is going to be lifted up. Why is that important? Because when we go over to Daniel, where this term originates, well, that's what it says is going to happen. The Son of Man, Daniel sees a vision of the Son of Man high and lifted up. So when Jesus tells Nicodemus the Son of Man is going to be high and lifted up, well, the Jewish mindset is, of course he is. He's going to be exalted, elevated. Right? Of course, Christ is using a play on words intentionally. He is going to be lifted up, and it is going to be high and exalted, but it's also going to be physically lifted up off the earth, right, on the cross. He intentionally used that play of words and built that ambiguity into what he's saying, where it can be understood both ways, because it was both ways. Now, the offense for the Jews of calling Jesus the Son of Man, even after or especially after the crucifixion, was because of the crucifixion. The idea that the Son of Man was lifted up on a cross, that was very offensive. Think to Corinthians, where Paul says that the preaching of the cross is an offense unto the Jews. Why? Why is this so offensive? Well, it's so offensive because Christ, throughout his entire ministry, has self-labeled himself, has named himself the Son of Man. And his lifting up wasn't what they expected. When we're going to read Daniel in a minute, it was something else entirely. Now, what Christ is telling us here in John chapter 13, where our text is that it is both. Christ, in being lifted up physically on a cross in shame and in weakness, is the glorification of the Son of Man, high and lifted up. It's the same thing. But it doesn't look like the same thing. It looks very different. And it's almost macabre how Jesus would say that, right? That I'm going to be lifted up, and you're thinking, woohoo, great. And then it turns out what he's saying is, I'm going to be stripped naked and hung on a cross. It's almost like dark humor, almost, for Nicodemus to tell him that this way, where it could be so easily misunderstood. But it's not that he's trying to mislead. It's that these things are one and the same event. Let's read Daniel real quick, so you can kind of get a sense of where this has come from. So when you see Son of Man in the New Testament, in the Gospels, you can understand where he's coming from. This is the vision that he's referring to. So Daniel has his vision. It's a great vision. He says, I beheld, Daniel chapter 7, verse 9. Excuse me. It says, I beheld till the thrones were cast down, and the Ancient of Days did sit, that's God the Father, whose garment was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was like a fiery flame, and his wheels as burning fire. So, real quick, you're wondering what the wheels are. So, the throne is obviously a chariot, right? It's a form of a chariot. You sit in it, and that was very common in the Orient in those days, for the thrones to actually be chariots. They weren't like, we think of like a marble throne, like you would get at the Lincoln Memorial, right? Sitting there immobile. That's not how they were. It's not how this one is. He has this fiery chariot throne, and there's fire flowing out, right? In verse 10, a fiery stream issued and came forth before him. So what it is it's this chariot of fire, this throne chariot of fire with fire pouring out all around it. That's how God is visualized by Daniel, okay? And he says, thousands and thousands ministered unto him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. And the judgment was set, the books were opened. I beheld because of the voice of the great words which the horn spake. I behold even till the beast was slain, and his body destroyed and given to the burning flame. Skip to 13, he says, I saw in the night visions, and behold, and this is the one. So he said this whole vision of God, the Father, the flame, the fire, all the millions of angels. And then I see one like the Son of Man who comes with the clouds of heaven, and he comes to the Ancient of Days, and they're brought near before him. And there was given him dominion and glory and a kingdom that all people, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom that which shall not be destroyed. That's the vision. That when Jesus says the Son of Man is going to be lifted up, that's what he is referring to. And there isn't a Jew on earth at that time that didn't know what that was. There isn't a single one of them who are not keenly aware of this vision of Daniel. So when Jesus says, I'm the Son of Man, that's who he's saying he is. And when Jesus is not sitting on a fiery throne or next to a fiery throne and has dominion forevermore, at least in their eyes, well, then that is highly offensive. It's the same way you feel whenever an unbeliever diminishes Christ and says, well, he's not really God. He didn't really do the miracles. He didn't really resurrect from the dead, and you find that offensive. You reel back at that and you say, I don't like that. That's offensive to me. Well, that's why the cross is offensive to the Jews. That's why. Because what the Christians were saying, what Jesus was saying, what the disciples were saying, is that his exaltation wasn't just after the cross, it was the cross. That's what they preached. That wasn't just a hiccup in the trajectory of Christ's majesty. That was the point. That's what Paul says. He says, that's what we preach. We don't avoid the cross. We don't focus on Christ ascending into heaven. You don't have any sermons on ascension. In the scriptures, there aren't any. You don't have them hardly preaching about anything other than Christ and him crucified. That is the gospel. Because for the apostles, that was his glorification. That was offensive. Because it doesn't look like this. Right? When you look at the cross and what happened on the cross, it doesn't look like what Daniel is explaining at all. But it is. It's exactly what Daniel's explaining. Okay. And if we look through and we can see that this is across Scripture, this is the case. For instance, in Hebrews 12:2, it says, Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is set down on the right hand of God. That was his exaltation. Exalted through the cross. That was the trajectory. That was the path. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 2:1 that he came not with excellency of speech, but he determined not to know anything among you save Jesus Christ and him crucified. In Galatians 6:14, Paul writes, but God forbid that I should glory save in the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ. In 1 Corinthians 1:17, he says, Christ sent me not to baptize, but to preach the gospel, not with wisdom of words, lest the cross of Christ should be made of none effect. For the preaching of the cross is to them that perish foolishness, but to us that are saved, it is the power of God. Just throughout the New Testament, this is a very clear thing. Now, I bring all this up because I think we ought to consider a certain element of this, and that there is a rift between modern-day Christianity, or what we could call evangelicalism, and Roman Catholicism. There's a difference in things that we emphasize, and it's something we should all think about for a second. So if you look at Roman Catholicism, they emphasize the death and suffering of Christ. It's monumental in their meeting and their liturgy and their theology. It's very important. It's all about the death and the suffering. A lot of it, it's what they really focus on. And evangelicals tend to really want to focus on the resurrection and the triumph, right? That's where our focus tends to gravitate towards. Now, they both have a point, and they both are mistaken in part, right? It is true that I think that the Roman Catholics are overemphasize the death and suffering. Because without the resurrection, the death was meaningless. You have to have the resurrection. The resurrection is not nothing. It is something very important. Paul writes and says, if Christ didn't raise from the dead, then your whole faith is null and void. It's worthless. Right? He had to have raised from the dead. If he's dead only, then you got nothing. So the resurrection is very important. But we tend to, evangelicals tend to, not always, but tend to just sort of shy from the whole idea of the cross. It's one reason why you don't see a lot of crosses in Christian churches, right? They just kind of like, it's just kind of like they're uncomfortable with the whole notion. Well, we need to understand that the apostles were not uncomfortable with this. And they didn't shy away from it. Not only did they accept the doctrine of the cross, they embraced it in their own lives. It's a very important thing. One of the problems with, and I don't want to speak to Roman Catholics because they're not here, and that's not really helpful, right? So let's talk about us. One of the problems with us shying away from the doctrine and the teaching of the cross and what the cross is that we're also pushing away the cross in our own lives. The teaching of the apostles, the teaching of the New Testament is very clear. When they said that they preached the cross of Christ, this wasn't just the historical fact of Christ being crucified, but the ongoing daily crucifying of our own will. Dying daily with Christ. This is a very important element of Christianity that in many evangelical churches is terribly overlooked. And nowadays it seems like Christianity is all about living your better life. When it's never been about that, it should be dying with Christ. That should be the focus of Christianity. We're not given any other. There is no passage in the Bible that's about you living your better life. There is none. When we're talking on this context, these scriptures are very clear. Paul said that he gloried in the cross of Christ. He doesn't just mean in an artifact hanging on a wall. That's not what he's referring to. He says, because on the cross of Christ, I am dead to the world, and the world is dead to me. That's what he says in Galatians 6. I'm dead to the world, and the world is dead to me. That's how he glories in the cross of Christ. In the cross, Christ is glorified. And that's what Jesus is saying here in John chapter 13. He says, after Judas has left, he says, now is the Son of Man glorified. And he will be glorified very soon, straight away. He's referring to his crucifixion. He's actually not referring directly to his resurrection. It is on his cross that he was glorified. Now, it didn't seem that way at all. And this is why Christ is telling them this. This is why he wants them to hear this. Because they're going to, very quickly after this, they're going to come up upon him being arrested and scourged and tried and convicted unfairly and hung up on a tree and killed and thrown into a grave. And it's going to seem like everything has gone to pieces. And everything is going to seem very, very dark. Maybe the world seems that way to you now. Very, very dark. But Christ wants them to understand that they're just not seeing things as they really are. What Christ accomplished on the cross, that was the work of salvation. That is where he was glorified. When you read in Daniel, it says the Son of Man is going to receive, how does he say it? In Daniel 7, he says that the Son of Man is going to he's going to receive dominion and glory and kingdom and people of all nations and languages. That's from the cross. That's how the Son of Man received all of these things, was on his sacrifice on the cross. That's where he is glorified and exalted. That's where God is glorified in Christ. It's where Christ is glorified in God. It just doesn't seem that way if you don't know what to look for. So this is what Jesus is trying to explain to them. He's trying to put in a nutshell in what is later was called a doxology. This magnificent praise, offering of praise, right? He's trying to explain to them when everything is going to look very dark and dead and that everything's over, it's really not. The Son of Man is being glorified and lifted up and highly exalted, and it's on the cross that Christ became, and I don't mean this in a real sense, but I mean just in taking that position completely is when he became that prophecy of Daniel of the Son of Man. And that's why, as I said, this prophecy and that appellation was so offensive to the Jewish people, because it just seemed just blasphemous, right? That you would take this description of the Son of Man and you would apply it not only to the person who died on the cross, but at the moment he hung on the cross, and you're saying, that's the Son of Man. That was very, very offensive. All right, we need to end there. But I would encourage you, as I said at the beginning, go through and read this. Try to read in a way that's meaningful. Try to make sense of how the conversation's actually taking place. Do that this week and study this passage. I think it'd be good for you. All right? All right, we'll take a brief recess, and then we'll continue on at 5.